You're watching Beyond Markets, where we bring you up to speed on development outcomes in Africa. Welcome, I'm Esther Awuni. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll explore the leadership and democracy and links between Africa and the U.S. in this election year. As always, you can join the conversation on social media. Let me know what you think about the topics we discuss. And to do so, use the hashtag Beyond Markets. You can also send me a message on Twitter on my handle at Esther O. Awuni. Now, a wave of elections are expected in Africa this year as we put the spotlight on the state of leadership and democracy on the continent. My guest today says former Tanzanian President, the late Julius Nyerere, told him that it was unfair that only Americans get to vote for the U.S. President because the world has so much riding on whom that person would be. As the presidential election year in the U.S. takes shape, today 15 jurisdictions in the U.S. representing about 40% of the U.S. population will hold a primary event, and 38% of all Democratic pledged delegates will be allocated. Ambassador Charles Stith, the chairman of the African Presidential Leadership Center and a former U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania, joins me for today's discussion. Ambassador, thank you for taking the time out to join us today. Let me start with leadership and democracy and how these two have evolved on the African continent. Now, I know that the African Presidential Leadership Center believes that engaging current and past African leaders and to also understand their challenges and successes is a good resource for the next generation of leadership. I'd like you to just speak to that point, the role of the APLC in engaging these leaders and how it is translated into perhaps better leadership on the continent.
Well, first of all, Esther, it's great to be with you again. The issue that you've raised in terms of connection between past leadership, current leadership, and future leadership is very important. George Santayana, the Harvard philosopher, once said that those who don't know the past are doomed to repeat it. So it's important to make those connections. The other rationale, or I should say related rationale, for the work that we do at the African Presidential Leadership Center is that much of the database or the fund of knowledge about Africa is a knowledge base created by others outside the continent. You know, I was reminded of this when former Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi passed a few weeks ago. Conventional wisdom in the West was that he was an autocrat. But if you go to the story behind the story, one appreciates that the current course of democracy that they enjoy in Kenya was a foundation laid by Moi. When it came to changing the Constitution to facilitate multi-party elections, nobody thought he would do it, yet he did. When the election was set, nobody thought he'd go through with it in the West, but he did. And when it seemed as though his hand-picked successor, Uhuru Kenyatta, was going to lose, they thought surely now he'll intervene and usurp the election process, and he didn't. And so that kind of inside baseball, if you will, that kind of understanding of what leaders like Moi did, which don't really register on the radar screen of the West, is important information to be able to access. And that's at the heart of our work at the African Presidential Leadership Center.
Let's quickly talk about democracy in Africa and how it has evolved. Now, over the years, as a journalist, I've spoken to so many political analysts, and one thing that comes through for me, based on what many of them have said, is that they feel that Africa perhaps should have its own brand of democracy. Now, even though that is the prevailing foundation upon which we have leadership on the continent, we're still in a situation where many leaders on the continent continue to hold on to power, even when their tenures are up. We've seen many of them, even in recent times, trying to tweak their constitutions just to enable them stay in power longer. Now, I know that is not, it's not happening broadly across the continent, but we still have a few cases of that happening. But what are your thoughts in terms of how democracy has served the African continent? And are you one of those people who believe that perhaps Africa should have its own brand of democracy?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, democracy is democracy. I mean, and you can't have your own brand of democracy. People are either empowered to participate in the process of selecting their leaders and holding their leaders accountable, or they're not. Now, having said that, I think Africa is trending in the right direction. We've really kind of followed the trend of democratization on the continent for 20 years through my work with the African Presidential Leadership Center here and my work with the African Presidential Center in Boston University when I was on the faculty there. And when I started my work in 2001 at Boston University, there were only 13 democratic states on the continent. There were only 11 democratically retired African heads of state and government. Today, there are 16 countries that fall on the spectrum of democracies on the continent. And today, there are more than 40 democratically retired African heads of state and government. So the continent is moving in the right direction. I think the recent advances in Ethiopia are promising. So those number of states, I think, can rightly increase to 17 in the very near future. Now, while 16 or 17, take your pick, countries on the continent that are rightly described as democracies represents around a third of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The good news is those 16 or 17 countries have more than 2/3 of the population of Africans on the continent. The aggregate population of those 16, 17 states is well over 1 billion. That's a substantial market, number one. Number two, that represents the kind of critical mass that can continue this trend toward democratization on the continent. So in a nutshell, I'd say that the continent isn't where it wants to be, but it certainly is not where it used to be, and it's a lot better off today than it was yesterday.
Now, we have a number of presidential elections that will hold this year on the continent. How are you tracking these elections? Are you talking to some of the parties involved? Are you speaking to former presidents of those countries in terms of just gauging what the outcome could possibly be, or what the citizens are thinking, and just getting on the back of ensuring that the elections are peaceful and fair?
Well, we will be tracking the political occurrence on the continent during this election season. I'd make an attempt to get around the continent on a reasonably regular basis. In May, for example, I'll be in Nigeria. Hopefully we'll be able to get together while I'm there. In addition to Nigeria, I'll be going through Kenya and Tanzania. We tend to stay in touch with former heads of state and government over the course of the year to get a feel for the trends and currents. And our sense is that those countries that fall squarely in the Democratic column are not going to deviate from that path, and that, again, the continent is trending in the right direction.
Now let's quickly talk about state of security on the continent. We've seen a number of countries, Nigeria inclusive, dealing with rising terrorism. We're seeing the Sahel region also dealing with that. How worried or how concerned is the APLC in terms of how this could impact on the ability of countries to, further democracy and, of course, just advance the well-being of their people, while at the same time having to devote so much resources to fighting terrorism?
Let me kind of back into that question. I was appointed to Tanzania. Well, I took my post in Tanzania 1 month after Al-Qaeda blew up the embassy in Dar es Salaam and in Nairobi. So this issue of terrorism in Africa has been something that I've paid significant attention to since 1998. And I've concluded several things. One, to deal effectively with terrorism on the continent of Africa requires a partnership, a meaningful partnership between African states and the West. One of the reasons that I'm troubled by this recent announcement by the Trump administration that they're going to start to soften their support through the African Strategic Command in anti-terrorist efforts are of real concern. You're right. The transnational security threat that terrorism represents for Africa is as significant as the transnational security threat terrorism represents for the West. So there has to be a meaningful partnership in order to deal with these threats. The second point that I would make is that there needs to be greater collaboration between the West and African leadership in dealing with the weak and failed states on the continent. One of the blowbacks, the fall of Gaddafi, was that the terrorists who were responsible for protecting Gaddafi then moved into Mali. And what was then a stable state found itself undermined. And I can't help but believe that there had been greater conversation between Western leadership and African leadership. The Libyan situation might have been handled differently. Had it been handled differently, we wouldn't see the problems that we see in Mali and in West Africa right now. So terrorism is a threat. It not only represents a problem for those countries in which you have very, very direct attacks, but because of the potential of destabilizing stable governments, it represents a threat for the continent as a whole.
If you're just joining us, Ambassador Charles Stith, Chairman of the African Presidential Leadership Center, is our guest today on the show, and we have been exploring democracy and leadership. Ambassador, thank you for your time so far. I'd like us to just quickly leave the African continent for a second and just quickly talk about the elections in the U.S. At the moment, or the forthcoming elections. Now, of course, we've all been watching the debates, especially the Democratic debates. And of course, conversations and questions have been asked as to whether or not the Democratic Party can put forward a candidate that can possibly defeat President Donald Trump. Now, of course, you have also put out a note, shared your thoughts on what you say, what is at stake for the party and for the country as a whole. Could you just share your thoughts, starting with, first of all, if you think the Democratic Party can put forward a formidable candidate that could beat President Donald Trump?
I am absolutely certain that the Democrats will field a candidate that can defeat President Trump. And I'd add that I think that's important for America, obviously, but it's also important for Africa. We've had a succession of presidents, starting with Bill Clinton, that have been very proactive in engaging the African continent around issues of trade and development, as well as democratization. That's lapsed under the Trump administration, and hopefully with the Democrat in the White House, those initiatives will pick back up. Needless to say, for those of you who've been following the Democratic primary season, it's been a wild and woolly affair up to this point. The last debate being a case in point. On Tuesday, March the 3rd, it's Super Tuesday, there are multiple states that will be voting. And I think at that point it'll become clearer who has the best chance of becoming the prospective nominee of the party. At this point, Bernie Sanders is a narrow front runner. The interesting thing is in both the primaries and caucuses that have taken place to date, while he won the primary in New Hampshire and the caucuses in Nevada, in New Hampshire, it was very, very close with Pete Buttigieg. And in Iowa, Buttigieg actually got an edge over Bernie Sanders in terms of the delegate count. So Super Tuesday will be interesting to watch. Now, having mentioned Sanders and Buttigieg, I would suggest that there's another candidate that needs to be watched, and that's former Vice President Joe Biden. There's an election in South Carolina that will be coming up very soon. He's projected to win that election, which will be a springboard into Super Tuesday. And while a lot of focus will be on Texas and California, if Biden can go into Super Tuesday and win Alabama, he then burnishes his case to be the Democratic standard bearer. And here's why. One of the critical things for the Democrats is not only to win the White House, but also to win the Senate and to maintain control of the House. Who tops the ticket is going to have an impact on that. In Alabama, there is a Democratic U.S. Senator by the name of Doug Jones, the first Democratic senator in recent history in the state. If Biden can win Alabama, he can then make the case that he's the best person to top the ticket. Subsequent to Super Tuesday, there are a number of other states that are key to him making the case in terms of viability. Those include Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida. Some of those are states which Obama carried during his last re-election campaign, which Trump flipped. So if if Biden can win those states, he can make a serious case for being the nominee, despite the fact that he might have the second fewest number of votes going into the convention. Although there's a real possibility that he can win a plurality. I don't think anybody will have enough delegates on the first ballot to win. So how all of these races play out is going to be very, very interesting.
Now, a number of topics, especially around the economy, have been discussed in the run-up to to the election. But one that appears to have been a sticking point is healthcare. Given one or two candidates say they can bring about free healthcare to all Americans. But I know that even in the Obama era, it continued to be a sticking point. But just help us understand how that conversation has panned out so far within the election in each of the campaign for each candidate, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side.
Well, you rightly pointed out that health care is going to be a major issue during this campaign. I'd also add that gun control, creating a broader pathway to economic opportunity are also going to be high on the list of things that voters will consider during the general election. On the health care issue, all of the Democratic candidates advocate universal health care. So they are all on the progressive end of the spectrum. The big debate is how do you get there from here? You've got Bernie Sanders, who argues that there ought to be health care for all. And the biggest knock against that particular policy position is, how do you pay for it? The other knock against the position is that you've got 168 million Americans who have private health insurance, the vast majority of which are happy with their insurance. So, how do you take something from someone who's happy with it to convince them to do something else is a bit problematic, to say the least. Most of the other Democrats fall somewhere on the spectrum of Medicare for all who want it, to use the phrase which Pete Buttigieg has coined. And I think it's that more certain, that more deliberate approach to providing universal health care is the thing that's going to probably have the broadest appeal.
Ambassador, with all that being said, I mean, the whole world looks to the U.S. for leadership when it comes to democracy, as a model nation, so to speak. But, in the last 3-4 years, just looking at how politics has unfolded in the U.S. and how, we've seen one or two issues, that speaks to the strength of democracy in the U.S. Even you did say, you alluded to some of that in your notes, where you say that the president doesn't believe the Constitution is worth the paper it's written on. And you say that the U.S. does have a Senate majority leader that cares only about power and nothing about the American people. And we've also seen a change in U.S. policy, especially as it relates to countries across the globe, especially on the trade side of things. We're seeing a changing relationship. We're looking at, I know that the U.S. still wants to maintain strong ties, obviously, with Africa, but we have seen a major shift in foreign policy and the way the U.S. interacts and engages other nations. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, to pick up where you started, and that is the conversation I had with the late Julius Nyerere, when he said, it's unfair that only Americans get to vote on the U.S. presidency because of the impact the person in that office has. I think if you asked our Western allies who their preference would be in the next election, probably wouldn't be President Trump. And I think the same could be said for states on the African continent, notwithstanding the polite reception that administration officials get when they visit the continent. Look, we live in a highly interconnected global universe. America First, quite frankly, really has translated into America alone. We're interdependent in an economic sense, as this recent coronavirus pandemic has punctuated when it comes to issues of health and welfare. We're interconnected. We can't deal with health problems like the coronavirus unless there's international cooperation. We can't continue the kind of progress that we've made globally in terms of expanding opportunity and increasing the size of the middle class without some degree of cooperation internationally. So, I think Americans are concerned, in this election probably more than any other, with America's position in the world. And I think that'll be a factor in terms of the things that are considered in November when Americans go to the polls.
Now, let me ask you this. What can or should Africa expect should there be another 4 years of the Trump administration?
Well, I think that it's going to be challenging. But I'm of the mindset that every challenge carries with it an opportunity. Absent concerted U.S. leadership around issues of trade and development, I think African leadership will be compelled to get even more serious about strategies for economic integration and economic cooperation on the continent. Again, to go back to the point that I made earlier, when you look at those countries that are clearly democratic on the continent, that have free market economies and a regulatory regime that is friendly toward investment, you're talking about a market of 1 billion people. So if Africans begin to exploit that economic potential much more substantially, it certainly will accrue to the continent's benefit. The other point that I would make is I think the continent needs to get much more serious about engaging the African diaspora. African Americans, for example, have an aggregate income of well over $1 trillion a year. If that were GDP, we'd be the 9th largest economy in the world. African Americans spend upward of $50 billion a year on trade and tourism. African governments need to get more aggressive about marketing the continent to African American tourists.
Ambassador, I must thank you for your time today. Thank you so much for talking to us. Thank you very much indeed. I've been speaking to Ambassador Charles Stith. He's a chairman of the Africa Presidential Leadership Center and a former U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website. That's cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and of course, you can follow my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther O. Awoni. For myself and the team, do have a great day.